Now I'll go into what's being done about this. So one of the things that we do in putting these meetings together is to try to get feedback from the CRA as to what are their initiatives, and is there anything that they can be that we could be helping to assist with. And I've got a response from Jennifer Wimet, who's one of the people in Ottawa who's helping direct the policy of the program, as to some of the initiatives that they're taking that they believe will help claimants self-assess their claim and ideally help the CRA at the same time manage the workload. So some of the things that they're talking about that they would like feedback on are something called the Self-Assessment Learning Tool, the Preclaim consultation and Preclaim review, and insights into those experiences. They're also looking for feedback from industry associations on things that are specific to an industry, and input from small versus large shred claimants to see what's specific about the claims for each of those. So we'll try to address those issues as we go through, but I'm going to focus on both the Self-Assessment Learning Tool and the Preclaim process. So the Self-Assessment Learning Tool is basically two forms that you fill out. I was unable to upload these forms to the presentation since they're actually protected forms. So you can go to the CRA website, type Self-Assessment Learning Tool in, and download basically two forms. The first is just a general overview of the SALT program itself, that it's basically going to tell you that if you're doing SR&ED, you can fill out a form. The step two, in my view, is really just the T661 description in a fillable format. So basically, they provide you with the T661 form in a fillable format with some direction behind it to ask you, what were your technological advancements, what were your technological uncertainties, how much did you spend, and that you can fill this out and assumedly send it in to initiate the pre-claim process review. Okay, as we said in our statistics, the pre-claim process review or consultations haven't really been a popular item, and one of the reasons the CRA is trying to look at it is to increase this and understand why are people willing to do it or unwilling to do it? How could we get more people involved in it? So one of the things that I think that we need to do is look at, does the information in the SALT tool provide relevant information to really allow the claimant to self-assess? And I would propose that basically going through the T661 form and talking about start and end dates and things like that are useful, but I'm not sure that it's really a tool that's going to allow people to pull together the kinds of descriptions that the CRA is looking for, and in particular to manage a large team of people. So where you have a team of maybe 20, 30, 40 scientists or engineers and you need them to share ideas and communicate, again, I'm not sure that just providing a form and asking some general questions, as the current SALT tool does, is going to be effective in that manner. So one of the things that I've thought about is I've looked around, and different practitioners have developed their own tools for doing this. Numerous practitioners do. There's online tools, there's different tools that I think ultimately do what we're talking about, to allow the claimant to assess whether they've done something eligible, and if so, what are the proper steps to take then to complete, to not only initiate but to follow the documentation process throughout the year. So one is an example of the format that I recommend to clients. This isn't specific to me. This is really a universal format. I call it the scientific method or scientific description, and I find that this outlines very effective in helping people to understand the structure of what we're looking for and the rationale behind it. So really what we're talking about is the scientific method here. You have your objectives, you have your uncertainties and hypothesis, and then you have your analysis results and conclusions. What I find very powerful about this method is that when I deal with claimants, it seems to be a universally understood definition. So I can talk to people from any country, any region, any language, And when I say the scientific method, it doesn't really matter where they're from. They're going to give me the same structure of objectives, hypothesis, analysis, results, conclusions. So the more that we can follow that, I think, in any kind of documentation, the better I think it is. To talk about merely what's your technological advancement as a concept in itself without having the correct structure tends to lead people to talk about things that aren't necessarily relevant, or to leave pieces of information out that are necessary and down the road kind of leave a weakness in the claim. So the first thing that we want to do is to talk about objectives, and I like to call it, how are we thinking outside of the box? So the box would be what the government calls standard practice, or what in patents you might call prior art, or what generally would be standardly available knowledge to someone with the skills in that field of science. Most of the successful SR&ED tax cases have people who have a Bachelor of Science or equivalent as the primary investigators. So failure to have that or those benchmarks is definitely a hindrance to a successful claim. The next thing that we really want to do is we want to say, how can we quantify objectives, or how can we stack up our objectives to show how the objectives as a whole are thinking outside the box? The issue here is that very often there's no single objective that creates a problem. With unlimited time and money, we may be able to achieve the project objectives. However, there may be price points on it, or there may be performance issues, or there may be blockages as far as intellectual property that a competitor owns that we're not allowed to use, or any number of things. So being able to quantify what are our benchmarks of performing products or competitive products, and what are our objectives, and how are we stacking up against this, often helps to provide a framework where the user can then go in and understand at a very basic level what combination of objectives are representing a potential advancement. This then allows us to start talking about two things: the relevant benchmarking sources and what I call the variables of experimentation, or the hypothesis. One of the biggest problems that we're seeing on a self-assessing process that I've seen through the various tax court cases, particularly ones that are unsuccessful, as well as the ones that are successful, is how do we define the scientific or SR&ED hypothesis? And this seems to be a term that a lot of people are having a lot of problem in understanding the definition. So in SR&ED, the courts, when they talk about a hypothesis, don't just mean a general idea based on fact. They basically mean that it has to be an SR&ED hypothesis, it has to be benchmarked against existing standard practice knowledge sources. And we'll talk about this, or we'll illustrate this hopefully a little more when we do our case analysis in section 3. But what I found in looking at tax court cases and eligible and ineligible projects is the successful projects are generally able to isolate variables for experimentation and to rank those variables in order of technical significance. So the key issues there being, can you get a team to agree at the start of a project, what is it we're trying to achieve? What are the major objectives? Which of those are causing problems or uncertainties, if any? And how can we prove that by benchmarking to similar products or methods out there in the market? So again, this is nothing new, but I'm finding that if we want to get a system or a self-assessment system that's going to allow us to be relatively comfortable about what the claim entails and then what documentation is relevant, these first two steps are the most relevant. And if in situations I find where you can get involved on the very first meeting where the initial idea, the eureka idea is created, and get the team to agree, here's the objectives that we're looking at, and here's what we think the top 3 to 5 variables of experimentation would be, and why, benchmarked against standard practice, then I think you've got not only a good basis for understanding why the claim is eligible, but also in communicating what issues we would want to document to the researchers themselves. So once the team can agree that these 3 to 5 or 7 issues are the most significant issues or variables of uncertainty, then when every individual goes out and does his or her own work, they can think back, did my work help understand with the understanding of the interrelation of any of these variables, and if so, that would be the relevant experimentation. They can then track results, which compare to objectives, and conclusions, which compare to the variables. One of the problems that I see with a lot of claimants, unsuccessful claimants, is they talk about results, that they successfully achieved the objectives, but they don't provide conclusions. Okay? So results are a good indicator that maybe there was an advancement, but the conclusion is the ultimate indicator. The what did we learn now about these variables or their interrelation to the variables, the related system uncertainties, that was not readily apparent at the start. Okay, so basically the way something like that would look, and this is a free template anyone's welcome to use if they want, is you would talk about how do we benchmark existing technology or standard practice. The CRA says, you know, we should do this, but many of their examples just say that this was done. They don't really provide any example of what evidence would be relevant, how does it tie in, anything like of that nature. So basically you want to brainstorm as to anything that someone would do. It could be as simple as internet searches where you find articles, patent searches. You could look at suppliers, competitive products, queries to expert, or anything else, and try to get that information up front. It sounds a little onerous, but generally there's search methods that within an hour or two, if you have the right key terms, you can start to focus in on relevant patents, relevant articles, and relevant information that in turn cites other sources of information that should also be relevant. Okay? Secondly, benchmarking, trying to provide quantifiable objectives, in my personal view and looking at the cases, is very relevant, since the tax court cases say that SR&ED must involve extremely accurate measurements and subsequent analysis of those measurements. In fact, they go on to say that without such measurement or analysis, systematic investigation cannot exist. Okay? To then illustrate what a hypothesis is, I'm saying the system, the ideal system, could use the word hypothesis, which is misunderstood, but ultimately what the hypothesis is in most cases understanding the interrelation of variables. And it may be 2 or more variables, or it may be 3 or more variables, but generally speaking, if there's not enough variables, if it's only 1 or 2 variables, the courts will see this as fine-tuning. You use existing pieces of equipment and testing what ranges or combinations of ranges produce the best outputs is often seen as routine fine-tuning until the variables stack up. So for instance, if I say, well, I'm going to do 10 tests for heat, and then I'm going to do 10 tests for variable of pressure, it may seem like I have 20 tests, but in reality, in my DOE model, or design of experiment model, I have 100 tests. And if I add a third variable, the amount of glass fiber in a mold, now I'm up to 1,000 tests. So we see 3 or more variables is perhaps the basis of an eligible project, and 5 or more variables, particularly those that are interrelated, where a change in one variable, variable X, will have an unpredictable upstream or downstream effect on the other variables. That tends to be a very strong project. And then you can talk about how those variables interrelate in relation to standard practice of other methods that were used to achieve similar things. Once this step is done, I would find that the manager's job on the project or the self-assessment of the project is done, and now his or her job would be to communicate these issues and agree on these issues with the management, with the development team, to empower each of the users or researchers now to go out and talk about how many alternatives they looked at, how many prototypes they built, and provide other metrics to us that can help us to ascertain, or a reader, CRA reviewer, ascertain not only that the work is eligible, but the amount of work done relates well to the cost claim, so that we have some correlation there, that it's reasonable to assume that building prototypes may take longer than doing analysis or process trials, and having information on those types of parameters would again provide information that's relevant both to the claimant and also to the reviewer. Okay. Ideally, I find that the strong systems take quantified objectives and then they compare results, and they particularly focus in on unexpected results. So things that are expected tend to prove that you had a good understanding of the issues and things worked out as you expected. Again, maybe not the uncertainty, but if something is 200 or 300% of expectation or 0% of expectation, again, those are the results that could be indicative of some advancements or conclusions. So what we try to do is look for unexpected results and then try to explain them in the conclusion section, ideally how those variables interrelate, or that those variables interrelate in a method that wasn't expected or acknowledged before. That in turn would represent the technological advancement that the Canada Revenue Agency is looking for. One of the key issues is that you really need all these components, and that if any single component here is missing, you really are missing some of the key criteria, so the project starts to weaken itself and it may collapse on itself. The last part is then to look at the direct costs, the wages, either hours or costs, but ideally hours, contractor costs and materials, to again make sure on a reasonability basis that the user feels that had he or she been reading this as a third party, these costs would appear reasonable based on what was explained in the description. Okay, so that's basically a quick overview of what I'm proposing here, that the net file program itself says that there's all kinds of certified software. We can buy it from Walters Cleaver, we can buy Tax Prep, Profile, any number of returns, Dr. Tax for doing T1 returns, for doing T2 returns, and so forth. So maybe what we want to do is or the CRA would want to consider, is contemplating having some kind of certification for third-party tools for doing SR&ED tax credits. As I said, there's numerous types of software on the market, and they could give criteria as to what's required and allow some of the review to be done online. One of the problems that I'm finding, and one of my experiences on the SALT tool and the self-assessment process so far, is that many claimants do leave the process till the end of the taxation year in order to start the documentation. And of course, this makes everything harder. It's kind of like doing your bookkeeping at the end of the year. If you do things in a timely manner, you're going to have more relevant documentation. You'll have the opportunity to integrate prior art searches and things on a relevant basis rather than trying to go back. And more importantly, you'll be able to communicate the issues throughout the year to the researchers so that they have a flag of what to look for when they're dealing with uncertainties or variables. If those are communicated ahead of time, that's great. What I found is that most clients, again, like to do it at the end of the year, so getting them to do a self-assessment process where they have to submit the information ahead of time is a change in focus. But I think it's a positive change in focus. And some of the methods that you can use to do that are to tell them, look, why don't we look at this project on a go-forward basis? Because if we have the eligibility for SR&ED and we can outline what I call the square and triangle, we're thinking outside the box, and we've identified some hypothesis or variables that based on prior art we think we need to experiment in order to come up with a solution, then I think that the client would be willing to show that information to the CRA if they felt that the pre-claim process review was going to be favorable. Again, as Julie intimated before with the FTCAS or other things, and I had a similar experience with the pre-claim review where clients were told that they didn't qualify, and ultimately when they came to me, I looked at what they did and I felt they did qualify, and when we filed the claims, they were eligible. So again, I think a lot of the success of a program like this will be, again, the success of claimants, and we've got some preliminary numbers, but with only 200 to 230 people using this a year, I don't know that's representative. If the CRA does allow the pre-claim process review, or maybe formalize this a little more, there was talk in prior years about allowing partial credits to be given on that, so an advancement of the credit as an incentive to get people using this, so a self-assessment tool in combination with a pre-claim review. I think the other things is that you could have the opportunity now, if you're getting information up front before projects are started, to refer claims to IRAP or other kinds of funding agencies, particularly if the work's being done in a strategic area where that type of funding is available. So again, there's a lot of opportunity, I think, for synergy here in the development of the self-assessment tools, in the pre-claim process review, and in integration with other agencies. That also keeping these tools could work as a dispute resolution mechanism, that if there's disputes on eligibility, they could be addressed again via management or third-party mechanisms up front before a claim starts, rather than after the ultimate filing of the claim. Okay, on that basis, I will forward to the next presentation. and then I will leave it open. Actually, maybe I'll stop for 5 minutes and let Earl coordinate any questions on this, and then we'll talk about the software example. All right, Earl?
Anyone have any questions in this particular area? Well, thank you, David. Appreciate that. I think you're fine.